Have you ever looked back at someone who once meant everything to you and wondered why their absence still feels so present? Not because you still talk, not because they are still a part of your life, but because some people leave footprints on your soul that time never completely erases. And maybe that's the hardest truth about love. It doesn't always disappear when the person does. Sometimes, years later, a song can bring them back. A familiar scent can suddenly transport you to a moment you thought you had forgotten. A random street, a quiet afternoon, a certain season of the year, and without warning, your heart remembers what your mind has spent so much time trying to let go. We often believe that healing means forgetting, that moving on means reaching a day when their name no longer affects us, when their memory no longer visits us in the middle of the night, when old photographs become nothing more than pieces of paper. But what if healing was never about forgetting? What if some people were never meant to be erased? What if the goal was not to remove them from our story, but to learn how to read that chapter without breaking down every time we turn the page? Because the truth is, there are people who change us forever, people who arrive quietly and somehow become part of the way we see the world, part of the way we laugh, part of the way we dream, part of the way we love. And when they leave, they don't take those pieces back with them. They remain, hidden inside the person we become afterward. Maybe that's why letting go feels so impossible. Because we're not just saying goodbye to a person. We're saying goodbye to a version of ourselves that only existed when they were there. The version that believed forever was certain. The version that thought love alone could solve everything. The version that never imagined there would come a day when good morning texts would stop, when phone calls would become silence, when someone who knew every detail about your life would slowly become a stranger. Have you ever noticed how strange that is? One day, they know your favorite song, your biggest fear, the dreams you never told anyone else. And then one day, you no longer know where they are, who they spend their weekends with, whether they still drink coffee the same way, whether they still smile when they hear that song you both loved. How does someone go from being your entire world to becoming a memory you can no longer touch? Maybe you've asked yourself that question before. Maybe you've sat alone at night, replaying conversations that ended years ago, wondering if things would have been different if you had said one more thing, if you had tried harder, if you had loved better, if you had stayed, or maybe if you had left sooner, because that's what heartbreak does. It turns us into historians of our own pain. We revisit old moments, analyze old mistakes, search for answers hidden inside memories that can no longer be changed, as if understanding the ending might somehow soften the loss. But some endings refuse to make sense. Some people enter our lives carrying lessons disguised as love, and by the time we understand what they came to teach us, they're already gone. Yet, despite all the pain, despite the tears, despite the sleepless nights, despite the unanswered questions, would you really choose to erase them? If you could go back and remove every memory, every laugh, every late-night conversation, every moment their hand found yours, every time they made the world feel a little less lonely, would you truly want that? Or would you keep it all, even knowing how the story ends? That question changes everything, because maybe the real tragedy isn't that some relationships end. Maybe the real tragedy would be never experiencing them at all, never knowing what it feels like to love someone so deeply that they leave a permanent mark on your heart, never discovering parts of yourself through another person's presence, never learning the beauty, vulnerability, and courage that genuine love demands. And perhaps that's why, after all this time, one sentence continues to resonate with millions of broken hearts around the world. Don't cry because it is over, smile because it happened. Simple words. Yet for anyone who has ever loved and lost, they carry the weight of an entire lifetime. Because smiling after loss is not easy. It is not pretending the pain never existed. It is not denying the nights you cried yourself to sleep. It is not ignoring the emptiness someone left behind. It is something much harder, something much braver. It is choosing gratitude over bitterness, choosing appreciation over regret, choosing to honor what was beautiful instead of obsessing over what was lost. And maybe tonight, if your heart is still holding on to someone you can no longer have, this story is for you, not to help you forget them, but to help you see them differently, to understand that not every love story is measured by how long it lasts. Some are measured by how deeply they transform us. And sometimes, the most beautiful chapters in our lives are not the ones that stay forever. They are the ones that teach us how precious forever truly is. Before there was heartbreak, there were beautiful beginnings. Before the silence, before the distance, before two people became strangers, carrying the same memories. There was a time when everything felt impossibly simple, a time when just seeing their name appear on your phone could instantly change your entire day. Do you remember that feeling? That strange mixture of excitement and nervousness, the way your heart would race over something as ordinary as a message. The way a simple, "How was your day?" suddenly felt more valuable than 100 conversations with anyone else. Looking back now, it almost seems unreal. Not because it didn't happen, but because happiness often becomes dreamlike once it belongs to the past. And yet, for a while, it was real. Every second of it. The laughter, the anticipation, the comfort, the quiet certainty that someone out there was thinking about you at the same time you were thinking about them. Perhaps that's what makes the beginning of love so unforgettable. It's not just that we meet another person. It's that we discover an entirely new version of ourselves. A version that smiles more, laughs more, hopes more. A version that begins to believe life might be kinder than it once seemed. Maybe that's what happened to you. Maybe it started with a conversation you never expected to matter. A random encounter, a chance meeting, a friendship that slowly became something neither of you could ignore. At first, they were simply another person, just another face in the crowd, another voice among millions. But then something shifted, something almost impossible to explain. Their messages became the first thing you looked for in the morning. Their stories became your favorite stories. Their happiness somehow became connected to your own. And before you even realized it, they became important. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, the way sunrise fills a dark room, the way spring arrives after a long winter, the way a song becomes your favorite without you noticing how many times you've played it. Love often enters our lives like that, without permission, without warning, without announcing its intentions. One day you're perfectly fine on your own, and the next day, someone's presence feels like home. Do you remember the small moments? Because, strangely enough, those are often the memories that survive the longest. Not the grand declarations, not the dramatic gestures, but the ordinary things, the conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning, the jokes nobody else would understand, the way they looked at you when you weren't paying attention, the way they remembered details you had forgotten mentioning, your favorite drink, your biggest fear, the dream you were almost too embarrassed to say out loud. Those little moments carried a kind of magic, a quiet proof that someone was paying attention, that someone genuinely cared. And in a world where people are often distracted, rushed, and emotionally distant, being truly seen feels extraordinary. Maybe that's what love really is. Not fireworks, not perfection, not endless excitement, but the feeling of being understood, the feeling that someone recognizes parts of you that the rest of the world overlooks. And for a while, they did. They saw your strengths, but they also saw your flaws, your insecurities, your fears, your scars, and somehow they stayed, at least for a while. There is something profoundly healing about that kind of acceptance. For many of us, life teaches us to hide, to protect ourselves, to wear masks, to pretend we are stronger than we really are. But love, real love, invites us to put those masks down, to be vulnerable, to be honest, to let another human being witness the parts of us we usually keep hidden. And when they embrace those parts instead of rejecting them, something inside us begins to heal. Maybe that's why those memories remain so precious. Because they weren't just moments spent with another person. They were moments when we felt fully alive, fully known, fully accepted. Think about the happiest memory you shared with them. Not the biggest one, not necessarily the most romantic one, just the memory that still makes your heart soften whenever it returns. Maybe it was a road trip with no destination. Maybe it was a rainy afternoon spent talking for hours. Maybe it was sitting together in comfortable silence. Maybe it was laughing so hard that neither of you could breathe. Whatever it was, I doubt the memory is valuable because of what you were doing. It's valuable because of how you felt. Safe, connected, present. For those brief moments, life wasn't asking for anything more. The future could wait. The past didn't matter. There was only now. Only the warmth of being beside someone who made the world feel lighter. And isn't that remarkable? Out of all the years we spend alive, the moments we treasure most are rarely about achievements, rarely about money, rarely about success. They are about connection, about shared laughter, about feeling loved, about belonging. Perhaps that's why losing those moments hurts so much later. Because before love breaks our hearts, it first fills them. Before it teaches us how to grieve, it teaches us how deeply we can care. And before someone becomes a painful memory, they were once one of the most beautiful parts of our life. That truth matters. Because when we look back, it is easy to focus only on the ending, to let the pain rewrite the entire story. But not every beautiful thing becomes less beautiful because it ended. A sunset remains breathtaking even after darkness arrives. A song remains beautiful even after the final note fades away. And a love that once brought genuine joy does not lose its value simply because it could not last forever. For a season of your life, they were your happiness. For a season of your life, they made ordinary days feel extraordinary. For a season of your life, they reminded you that your heart was capable of loving far more deeply than you ever imagined. And perhaps, before we talk about what was lost, we should first honor what was found. Because before the goodbye, there was a beautiful hello, and before the ending, there was a love story worth remembering. But no one talks enough about the ending. No one tells us that sometimes love doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it fades. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Like a sunset you don't notice until the sky has already gone dark. Because if we're honest, most relationships don't end in a single moment. There isn't always a dramatic goodbye. There isn't always betrayal. There isn't always one final argument that changes everything. Sometimes the ending arrives disguised as ordinary days. A message that takes a little longer to answer. A conversation that feels slightly shorter than before. A laugh that sounds less genuine. A silence that lingers a little too long. At first, you barely notice it. You tell yourself you're imagining things. They're just busy. They're tired. Life is stressful. Everyone goes through phases. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's exactly what makes it so difficult to recognize when love is slipping away. Because the distance never announces itself. It simply grows. 1 inch at a time. One missed conversation. One canceled plan. One unspoken feeling. Until one day you wake up and realize the person who once felt closest to you now feels impossibly far away. And that realization, that moment when your heart notices what your mind has been trying to ignore, can be devastating. Because deep down, you already know. You know something has changed. You know the warmth isn't the same. You know the connection feels weaker. But part of you keeps hoping, keeps believing, keeps searching for the version of them that used to reach for your hand first. The version that couldn't wait to talk to you. The version that looked at you as if you were their favorite place in the world. And maybe that's one of the cruelest parts of heartbreak. Watching someone slowly become a stranger while they're still standing right in front of you. You can feel it happening. You can sense the distance growing. Yet somehow, you can't stop it. You try harder. You give more. You become more patient. More understanding. More forgiving. You convince yourself that if you love them enough, things will return to the way they were. But love is not a time machine. And effort alone cannot save two people who are moving in different directions. That truth is painful. Because when we love someone, our first instinct is to fight, to hold on, to refuse to believe the story is ending. After all, how could it end? How could something that once felt so real suddenly become so fragile? How could two people who once talked for hours struggle to find things to say? How could someone who once knew every detail about your day stop asking how you're doing? How could forever become temporary? Questions like these echo through the mind long after the relationship begins to crack. And often, there are no satisfying answers. Only silence. Only uncertainty. Only the unbearable feeling of watching something precious slip through your fingers. Do you know what hurts the most? It's not always losing the person. Sometimes it's losing the future you imagined with them. The future you built in your head. The trips you planned. The milestones you dreamed about. The life you quietly believed you would share. When a relationship ends, those dreams end too. And nobody prepares us for that grief. Because you're not just mourning what happened. You're mourning what will never happen. The memories that will never be created. The conversations that will never take place. The moments that now exist only in imagination. That kind of loss is difficult to explain. It feels like grieving a life that never had the chance to exist. And yet, somehow, the world keeps moving. People continue their routines. The sun rises. The seasons change. Everyone else seems fine. But inside you, something is shattered. Something fundamental. Something invisible. You go to work. You answer messages. You smile when you're supposed to smile. But beneath the surface, your heart is carrying a weight nobody else can see. Because heartbreak is often a private disaster. The world rarely stops for your pain. It simply expects you to continue. And maybe you do continue. Day after day. Step after step. Even when every step feels heavier than the last. But then come the reminders. The song you forgot existed. The restaurant you used to visit together. The photograph buried deep in your phone. The familiar scent that suddenly pulls you backward through time. And just like that, the wound opens again. Not because you want it to. Not because you're trying to suffer. But because love leaves traces. Tiny fragments scattered throughout your life. Fragments that refuse to disappear simply because the relationship did. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization of all comes much later. Not when the relationship ends. Not when the goodbye happens. But when you realize they are learning how to live without you. And you are learning how to live without them. Separate lives. Separate routines. Separate futures. The person who once occupied so much space in your world is now building a world that no longer includes you. That realization can feel unbearable. Because for so long, your stories were intertwined. Your hopes were connected. Your plans were shared. And now, they are simply another person walking a different path. A path you can no longer follow. A path you were never meant to control. And this is the moment where many hearts break completely. Not because love wasn't real. Not because the memories weren't beautiful. But because reality finally becomes impossible to deny. The chapter is ending. The person you once called home is leaving the story. And no matter how desperately you wish otherwise, you cannot turn the page backward. You can only stand there for a moment, holding the weight of what was, grieving the loss of what could have been, and wondering how something so beautiful could ever hurt this much. Because sometimes the deepest pain is proof of the deepest love. And sometimes the hardest part is not saying goodbye. It's accepting that the goodbye has already happened. And then comes the battle nobody sees. The battle that begins after the goodbye, after the tears, after the sleepless nights, after the moment you finally accept that they are no longer coming back. Because strangely enough, losing someone is only the beginning of the pain. The harder part comes afterward, when you're left alone with your thoughts, alone with your memories, alone with every question that never found an answer. This is where the mind becomes its own worst enemy, because the heart wants to heal, but the mind keeps returning to the scene of the wound, again, and again, and again, as if replaying the past enough times might somehow change the outcome. Have you ever noticed how heartbreak turns us into detectives? Suddenly, we begin investigating our own memories, searching for clues, examining conversations, replaying old moments late at night, looking for the exact point where everything started falling apart. Maybe it was something you said. Maybe it was something you didn't say. Maybe it was a decision, a mistake, a missed opportunity, a moment you should have fought harder, or a moment you should have let go sooner. The possibilities become endless, and that's the problem. Because the human mind struggles to accept uncertainty. We want explanations. We want reasons. We want a clear answer that allows us to place the pain neatly into a box and move forward. But love rarely gives us that luxury. Instead, it leaves us with questions. Thousands of them. What if I had been more patient? What if I had listened more carefully? What if I had loved them the way they needed to be loved? What if I had spoken up? What if I had stayed silent? What if I had chosen differently? What if? What if? What if? Those two words become a prison built from possibilities that no longer exist. And the cruel thing about regret is that it always speaks with the confidence of hindsight. Today, you know things you didn't know then. Today, you see mistakes that were invisible at the time. Today, you understand lessons that only pain could teach. But back then, you were simply trying your best with the knowledge you had. Yet the mind rarely shows itself that kind of compassion. Instead, it becomes a harsh judge, a relentless critic, pointing at every flaw, every failure, every imperfect moment, convincing you that if only you had been better, the story would have ended differently. For a while, you may even believe it. You may carry the entire weight of the relationship on your shoulders. You may convince yourself that everything was your fault, that you were not enough, not attentive enough, not attractive enough, not mature enough, not worthy enough. Heartbreak has a way of whispering those lies. And when we're hurting, those lies can sound like truth. But here's something most people don't realize. When a relationship ends, we often stop seeing reality. Instead, we begin romanticizing the past. We remember the best moments, the laughter, the affection, the connection, the beautiful memories. And slowly, we erase everything else. The disagreements, the incompatibilities, the misunderstandings, the struggles both people carried. We transform a real human being into a perfect memory. And then we compare reality to that memory. Of course, reality loses. Because memories never argue. Memories never disappoint. Memories never change. They remain frozen in time, perfectly preserved. And that's why moving on feels impossible. Because you're no longer competing with a real person. You're competing with an idealized version of the past, a version that never truly existed. Yet despite knowing this, you still miss them. You still wonder. You still imagine impossible scenarios. Maybe one day they'll call. Maybe one day they'll realize what they lost. Maybe one day life will bring you back together. And so a part of your heart remains suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, unable to fully live in today. But eventually, something begins to happen. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like dawn appearing after a long night. You grow tired. Not of loving them. Not of caring. But of carrying the same pain every day. You grow tired of replaying the same conversations. Tired of rewriting the same ending. Tired of fighting battles that only exist inside your head. And that's when a different question finally emerges. A question far more important than, what if? The question becomes, what now? What now that the story is over? What now that the future I imagine no longer exists? What now that I cannot change the past? For the first time your attention slowly shifts. Not backward, but forward. Not toward what happened, but toward what remains. And what remains is you. Not the version of you that existed inside the relationship. Not the version waiting for another chance. But the version standing here today. Broken, perhaps. Exhausted, certainly. But still breathing. Still growing. Still becoming. This realization is uncomfortable. Because healing requires us to release the fantasy that one more answer will finally fix everything. Sometimes there is no final answer. No perfect explanation. No missing piece. Sometimes a relationship ends because two imperfect human beings reach the limits of what they could give each other. Nothing more. Nothing less. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all is learning that closure is not something another person gives you. It is something you create for yourself. The moment you stop asking the past to become different. The moment you stop negotiating with memories. The moment you stop putting your life on hold while waiting for an ending that already happened. That doesn't mean the pain disappears. It doesn't mean you suddenly stop missing them. It doesn't mean your heart forgets. But it does mean something begins to change. The war inside you becomes quieter. The questions lose their power. The regrets become softer. And somewhere beneath all the grief, a tiny spark of peace begins to appear. Small, fragile, almost invisible, but real. Because for the first time since losing them, you are no longer fighting the past. You are slowly learning how to survive it. And then, one day, something unexpected happens. Not a miracle, not a message from them, not some dramatic moment that suddenly changes everything. In fact, the moment is so ordinary that you almost miss it. You wake up. You go about your day. You drink your coffee. You answer your messages. And somewhere between one ordinary moment and the next, you realize something. The pain is still there, but it no longer controls you. The memories still exist, but they no longer own you. For the first time in a long time, you are not asking why it happened. You are asking what it taught you. And that question changes everything. Because healing truly begins the moment we stop looking at our loss as a punishment and start seeing it as a lesson. Not every lesson arrives gently. Some arrive wrapped in heartbreak. Some arrive disguised as disappointment. Some arrive through people we desperately wanted to keep. But lessons do not become less valuable simply because they hurt. And perhaps that is the awakening. The realization that not everyone who enters our life is meant to stay forever. Some people arrive for a season. Some arrive for a chapter. Some arrive only long enough to change the direction of our story. Yet, we spend so much time measuring relationships by their duration. How many years did it last? Did it lead to marriage? Did it survive until the end? As if longevity is the only definition of success. But what if it isn't? What if the value of a relationship cannot be measured by how long it lasted? What if it should be measured by how deeply it transformed us? Think about it. There are people who spend decades together and never truly know each other. And there are people who enter our lives for a brief moment and leave an impact that lasts forever. Time alone cannot determine significance. Length alone cannot define meaning. Sometimes a short chapter changes us more than an entire book. And perhaps the person you lost was one of those chapters, not because they were meant to stay, but because they were meant to teach. Maybe they taught you how deeply you could love. Maybe they taught you that vulnerability is not weakness. Maybe they taught you that your heart is stronger than you once believed. Or perhaps they taught you something even more important. Perhaps they revealed parts of yourself you would never have discovered otherwise. The truth is, before we meet certain people, we think we know who we are. Then they arrive, and suddenly we discover new dreams, new fears, new strengths, new wounds. They become a mirror, reflecting pieces of ourselves we had never noticed before. And when they leave, that reflection remains, not because they are still present, but because the person we became through loving them continues to exist. That realization can be both beautiful and heartbreaking. Beautiful because it means love was not wasted. Heartbreaking because it means their purpose may have already been fulfilled. You see, one of the hardest truths to accept is that not every love story is meant to become a lifetime partnership. Some are meant to become a lesson, a blessing, a turning point, a catalyst for growth. We resist this idea because we confuse permanence with importance. We assume that if something ended, it failed. If someone left, the relationship lost its value. If the future we imagined never happened, then the entire experience was meaningless. But life doesn't work that way. A flower does not become worthless because it blooms for only a season. A sunset does not lose its beauty because night eventually arrives. A song does not become meaningless because it reaches its final note. And love does not lose its significance simply because it ends. In fact, sometimes its ending reveals its purpose. Because certain people enter our lives to awaken us, to challenge us, to expose the parts of ourselves that still need healing, to teach us lessons we could never learn through comfort alone. And while we are busy trying to keep them forever, life may have been trying to teach us through them. Perhaps that's why, years later, many people look back at their greatest heartbreaks with surprising gratitude. Not because the pain wasn't real, not because they wanted the relationship to end, but because they eventually understood what the experience gave them. Wisdom, strength, empathy, self-awareness, growth. The gifts often remain long after the person is gone, and maybe that's where your journey is leading you now, toward a deeper understanding, toward a different perspective, toward the realization that your story did not end when the relationship ended. If anything, a new chapter began. A chapter focused not on another person, but on yourself, the version of you that emerged from the experience, wiser, stronger, more compassionate, more aware of what truly matters. Because despite all the tears, all the questions, and all the nights spent missing them, you survived, you learned, you grew, and growth is never meaningless. Maybe that's why life sometimes takes people away, not to punish us, not to break us, but to guide us toward becoming someone we could not have become otherwise. Someone capable of carrying both love and loss in the same heart. Someone capable of remembering without falling apart. Someone capable of honoring the past without living inside it. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: the purpose of some people in our lives is not to stay forever. The purpose of some people is to help us become who we were meant to be. Once you understand that, the story begins to look different. The ending begins to feel different. And slowly, very slowly, the pain starts transforming into something else. Not bitterness, not regret, but gratitude. The kind of gratitude that can only emerge after a heart has learned the true meaning of love. And that is where healing truly begins. And then, one day, without even realizing it, you stop asking why they left, and you start feeling thankful that they came. It is a subtle shift, a quiet transformation, so gentle that you almost don't notice it happening. But it changes everything. Because there is a profound difference between remembering someone with pain and remembering someone with gratitude. Pain asks, "Why did this happen to me?" Gratitude asks, "How lucky was I to experience it at all?" For a long time, heartbreak convinces us to focus on what we lost. The relationship, the future, the plans, the dreams, the person. And while those losses are real, they are not the entire story. Because hidden beneath every ending is something we often overlook. The gift of having lived it. The gift of having loved. The gift of having experienced something beautiful enough to miss. Think about that for a moment. The very reason your heart hurt so deeply was because your heart cared so deeply. The sadness was evidence of the joy. The grief was evidence of the love. The emptiness was evidence that something meaningful once filled that space. And perhaps that changes the way we see our pain. Because suddenly, heartbreak is no longer proof of failure. It becomes proof that something precious existed. After all, nobody mourns what never mattered. Nobody cries over what never touched their soul. We grieve because something beautiful happened. We hurt because something valuable was real. And perhaps that's why gratitude eventually becomes stronger than sorrow. Not because the sorrow disappears, but because the meaning becomes greater than the loss. You begin to look back differently. The memories that once made you cry now make you smile. Not every time, not immediately, but gradually, the wound softens. The sharp edges become smoother. The sadness becomes gentler. And somewhere inside those memories, a warmth begins to emerge. You remember the laughter. You remember the adventures. You remember the moments when life felt lighter, simply because they were there. And instead of asking why those moments didn't last forever, you begin appreciating that they existed at all. Because the truth is, nothing lasts forever. Not youth. Not seasons. Not sunsets. Not even life itself. Everything beautiful eventually changes. Everything meaningful eventually transforms. Yet, we don't reject a sunset because it ends. We don't refuse to admire spring because summer will eventually arrive. We don't stop listening to our favorite song because it only lasts a few minutes. We treasure those things precisely because they are temporary. Their impermanence is part of their beauty, and perhaps love is no different. Perhaps the value of a relationship was never determined by how long it survived. Perhaps its value was always found in what it gave us while it existed. The comfort, the growth, the connection, the memories, the lessons, the joy. And once you begin seeing things this way, an extraordinary realization emerges. The relationship did not leave you empty-handed. It left you carrying treasures. Invisible treasures, perhaps, but treasures nonetheless. A deeper understanding of love, a greater appreciation for connection, a stronger sense of empathy, a clearer understanding of yourself, a wiser heart, a more compassionate soul. These are gifts, real gifts, and they remain yours even after the person is gone. Nobody can take them away. Not time, not distance, not endings, not even heartbreak itself. And maybe that's what maturity looks like. Not forgetting the people we loved, not pretending the loss never happened, but honoring both the joy and the sorrow, accepting that they can exist together. Because life is rarely one thing or another. It is often both. You can miss someone and still be grateful for them. You can feel sadness and appreciation at the same time. You can wish things had ended differently while still valuing everything they gave you. These emotions are not enemies. They are companions, different parts of the same human experience. And perhaps the most beautiful form of healing is learning to carry both. To carry the memory without carrying the bitterness. To carry the love without carrying the resentment. To carry the lesson without carrying the regret. Eventually, you stop seeing the relationship as something that was taken from you. Instead, you begin seeing it as something that was given to you. A chapter, a season, a gift, not yours to keep forever, but yours to experience. And there is a difference, a profound difference, because when we believe something was taken from us, we feel robbed. But when we recognize something was given to us, we feel blessed. The circumstances may be identical, yet the perspective changes everything. Suddenly, the ending is no longer the most important part of the story. The experience becomes the most important part. The moments become the most important part. The love becomes the most important part. And that realization slowly frees the heart. You no longer need the story to have lasted forever in order for it to matter. You no longer need a perfect ending to appreciate a beautiful chapter. You no longer need permanence to validate significance. Because now you understand something many people spend their entire lives trying to learn. Some of the most valuable things we ever receive are temporary, and their temporary nature does not diminish their worth. It enhances it, which brings us back to those simple words. Words that once seemed impossible to accept. Don't cry because it is over. Smile because it happened. When you are in the middle of heartbreak, those words can feel unfair, almost impossible. How can anyone smile when something they loved is gone? But now you understand. The smile is not replacing the tears. The smile comes after the tears, after the lessons, after the healing, after the long journey through grief. The smile is the soul's way of saying, yes, it ended, but I am grateful it existed. Yes, I lost it, but I am grateful I experienced it. Yes, it hurt, but it was worth it. And perhaps that is the highest form of love. Not possessing, not clinging, not demanding forever, but appreciating, honoring, remembering, and being thankful. Thankful that for one beautiful chapter of your life, two paths crossed, two hearts connected, and for a little while, the world became a brighter place because of it. If someone had told you back then, on the day your heart was breaking, on the night you thought you would never stop missing them, that one day you would be grateful for everything that happened, you probably wouldn't have believed it. Because pain has a way of narrowing our vision. When we're hurting, all we can see is what we've lost. The empty chair, the unanswered message, the future that disappeared, the person who is no longer beside us. But time has a remarkable way of revealing things that grief keeps hidden. And one of those things is growth. Not the kind of growth that happens overnight, not the kind that arrives with fanfare and certainty, but the quiet kind, the kind that happens while you're simply trying to survive, the kind that happens while you're putting one foot in front of the other, the kind that happens while you think nothing is changing at all. And then one day, you look back, and you realize something extraordinary. You are no longer the person who first fell in love. You are no longer the person who experienced that heartbreak. You have become someone else, someone stronger, someone wiser, someone deeper, someone who understands life in ways they never could before. Because love changed you, but loss changed you too. And perhaps that is one of the greatest paradoxes of the human experience. The things that hurt us most often shape us most profoundly. Think about who you were before this chapter began, before you met them, before your heart learned both the beauty and the burden of loving deeply. What did you know then? What did you understand about yourself? About relationships? About vulnerability? About courage? Perhaps not nearly as much as you know now, because there are lessons that cannot be taught through books, lessons that cannot be explained through advice, lessons that only life itself can teach. And love is one of life's greatest teachers. It teaches us how to open our hearts, how to trust, how to dream with another person, how to place our fears in someone else's hands. And sometimes, it teaches us how to let go, as painful as that lesson may be. You see, before heartbreak, many of us believe strength means holding on, fighting harder, refusing to quit, never giving up. But eventually, life teaches us a different definition of strength. Sometimes strength is letting go. Sometimes strength is accepting reality. Sometimes strength is releasing what no longer belongs in our future. Not because it lacked value, but because its purpose has already been fulfilled. That realization changes everything. Because now, when you look at your past relationship, you no longer see only the ending. You see the journey. You see the lessons. You see the transformation. You see the person you became along the way. Perhaps they taught you how to communicate. Perhaps they taught you what kind of love you truly need. Perhaps they revealed wounds you didn't know you were carrying. Perhaps they showed you patterns you needed to break. Perhaps they taught you boundaries, self-respect, patience, compassion. Or perhaps they taught you something even more important. Perhaps they taught you that your happiness cannot depend entirely on another person's presence. That lesson alone can change a life. Because eventually, after enough healing, you begin to understand that the love you were searching for was never meant to exist only outside of you. Part of it had to be cultivated within you. And once that realization arrives, a quiet confidence begins to emerge. Not arrogance, not superiority, just confidence. The confidence of someone who survived, someone who endured, someone who walked through heartbreak and discovered they were stronger than they ever imagined. You stop fearing loss in the same way, not because loss no longer hurts, but because you know you can survive it. You have evidence now. You have lived through it. You have carried grief. You have faced loneliness. You have endured uncertainty. And somehow, you kept going. That knowledge becomes part of you. It settles into your bones. It becomes a source of strength you can draw upon for the rest of your life. And perhaps that is one of the hidden gifts of every difficult chapter. It introduces us to parts of ourselves we would never have met otherwise. The resilient part, the courageous part, the compassionate part, the wise part, the part capable of rebuilding after everything falls apart. Those qualities were always there. But sometimes adversity is what reveals them. And when you finally see them, you realize that heartbreak did not only take something from you, it gave something back as well. A new perspective, a stronger character, a deeper understanding of what truly matters, a greater appreciation for genuine connection, a more authentic version of yourself. That doesn't mean you would choose the pain again. No one longs for suffering, No one asks for heartbreak. But if you could separate the lessons from the pain, if you could hold in your hands everything this experience taught you, would you really want to give it back? Many people discover that the answer is no, because as difficult as the journey was, it helped shape who they are today. And perhaps that is why some people remain meaningful long after they leave our lives. Not because we still belong together, not because we are meant to reunite, but because they became part of our evolution, part of our story, part of the road that led us here. Sometimes, the greatest impact a person has on our life is not the time they spend with us. It is the person we become because of them. And when you finally understand that, a surprising thought begins to emerge. A thought that once seemed impossible. If I could go back, knowing everything I know now, knowing how the story would end, knowing how much it would hurt, I might still choose to meet you. I might still choose the laughter, the conversations, the memories, the lessons, the love. Because although the relationship did not last forever, the growth did. The transformation did. The person it helped create still exists. And perhaps that person, the stronger, wiser, more compassionate version of yourself standing here today, is proof that even the most painful endings can become the foundation for something beautiful. Not another relationship, not another chapter, but a better version of you. And sometimes, that is one of the greatest gifts love can leave behind. And so, here you are, after all the tears, after all the questions, after all the nights spent staring into the darkness, wondering why life unfolded the way it did. You are still here, still breathing, still moving forward, still becoming. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this entire story. Not that you loved, not that you lost, but that you survived both. Because there was a time when you believed the pain would never end. A time when every memory felt like a wound. A time when every reminder seemed unbearable. A time when you could not imagine a future that didn't include them. Yet somehow, day by day, step by step, you kept going. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but honestly, humanly. You carried your broken heart through ordinary days. You learned how to smile again. You learned how to laugh again. You learned how to wake up without immediately thinking about what was missing. And somewhere along the way, something remarkable happened. Life began to return. Not the life you once imagined. Not the future you once planned. But a different life. A new life. One that you could not see while you were still grieving the old one. Because that is one of life's greatest mysteries. When a door closes, we spend so much time staring at it that we often fail to notice the new paths quietly opening around us. We become attached to one version of happiness, one outcome, one person, one dream, and when it disappears, we assume happiness disappeared with it. But happiness is rarely confined to a single chapter. Life is larger than that. Love is larger than that. Your story is larger than that. There are still people you have not met, conversations you have not had, places you have not seen, moments of joy waiting in futures you cannot yet imagine. And perhaps that is what hope truly is. Not certainty, not guarantees, not the promise that everything will happen exactly as you want. Hope is simply the willingness to believe that life still has beautiful surprises left to offer, even after disappointment, even after heartbreak, even after loss, especially after loss, because loss has a way of convincing us that the best days are behind us, that the most meaningful love has already happened, that the greatest chapter is over. But life has a gentle habit of proving us wrong, again and again. Sometimes the chapter we mourn becomes the chapter that prepares us for everything that comes next. Sometimes the ending we resist becomes the beginning we eventually appreciate. And sometimes the people we thought we could never live without become the reason we discover strengths we never knew existed. Looking back now, perhaps you understand something that once seemed impossible to understand. The relationship was never the entire story. It was a chapter, a beautiful chapter, a meaningful chapter, a chapter that made you laugh, a chapter that made you cry, a chapter that taught you what it means to open your heart. But it was never the whole book. Your story did not begin with them, and it does not end with them. There are still pages waiting to be written, still experiences waiting to unfold, still reasons to smile, still reasons to believe. And perhaps that realization allows you to hold the past differently, no longer with desperation, no longer with regret, no longer with the painful need to change what cannot be changed. Instead, you hold it with tenderness, with appreciation, with respect. You stop asking the memory to become your future, and simply allow it to remain what it already is. A beautiful part of your past. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because some people are not meant to stay forever. Some people are meant to leave behind memories, lessons, growth, and gratitude. And that is enough. More than enough. You know, there is something deeply peaceful about reaching the point where you can think about someone and simply smile. Not because you want them back. Not because you are pretending the pain never happened. But because you finally understand the full picture. You understand that love does not become meaningless because it ends. You understand that memories do not become worthless because they belong to yesterday. You understand that beauty does not disappear simply because it is temporary. In fact, perhaps its temporary nature is what made it beautiful in the first place. Like a sunset, like autumn leaves, like a song that eventually reaches its final note. Its ending is not a flaw. Its ending is part of what makes it precious. And maybe the same is true for many of the people who pass through our lives. They are not mistakes. They are not detours. They are not wasted time. They are experiences. Teachers, companions, gifts. Some remain for decades. Others remain only for a season. But every meaningful connection leaves something behind. Something valuable. Something lasting. Something that becomes part of who we are. So if your heart still aches when you think about someone you once loved, be gentle with yourself. That ache does not mean you failed to move on. It means you were fortunate enough to experience something worth remembering. Something that touched your soul deeply enough to leave an imprint. And there is no shame in that. There is beauty in that. Because, at the end of the day, the goal was never to forget. The goal was never to erase the past. The goal was never to become someone who no longer cares. The goal was always to remember without breaking, to appreciate without clinging, to love without possessing, to honor what was while still embracing what can be. And perhaps that is where true peace lives. Not in forgetting, but in understanding, not in holding on, but in letting go with gratitude, not in mourning forever what ended, but in celebrating that it happened at all. Which brings us back to those simple words. Words that now carry an entirely different meaning. Don't cry because it is over. Smile because it happened. Not because endings don't hurt. They do. Not because loss isn't painful. It is. But because some experiences are so beautiful, so meaningful, and so transformative that even their ending cannot erase their value. And if you are lucky enough to have loved someone deeply, if you are lucky enough to have shared laughter, memories, dreams, and moments that changed your life, then perhaps, despite everything, despite the ending, despite the goodbye, despite the tears, you were fortunate. Because for one extraordinary chapter of your life, love found you, and that alone is something worth smiling about.